Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome. This is the Exvangelical Bible Study. This is a new project that Justin and I are undertaking. We are going to work our way slowly through the whole thing, going through each of the books. I, the non-expert, am going to be rereading it and basically kind of asking questions from the perspective of someone who grew up in this faith, who used the text in a certain way. And then I'm very grateful for this awesome resource of Justin, who is credentialed and degreed in this area. So mostly I'm going to be asking him, is that what that really means? And what's the context for this? And so we're going to make our way through and learn a lot.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me with you, Sarah. And I'm looking forward to this. I think we're going to get a dig into some meaty issues that the typical churchgoer isn't going to hear from the pulpit. So
definitely, yes. So many things. I was just saying that I haven't sat down and read this in a really long time, and going through it line by line, there were so many things that I just skimmed over, didn't pay attention to. It's kind of wild. So for everyone listening, I have my Bible with me. This is my Bible. You might recognize that cover. So I'm going to just kind of talk us through some of it, and I'll be quoting some verses. Justin will have access to, and he's got all that information. So he may have different versions that he's quoting from. So what is this? It's the New Living Translation. Good luck.
Oh boy, this is gonna be fun. That's like a good paraphrase.
Right? Yeah. So that will several times I think I'm gonna say, what is that word really supposed to be in there?
It's kind of a good thing though that we'll start with the New Living Translation, because it's a very common translation in the church. A lot of people own an NLT. It's not that dissimilar from the NIV, which is the most common translation right now. So I think it'll be a good starting point. Most people listening to this probably will be familiar with the version that you're reading from.
Well, then that's good. Yeah, I grew up on the NIV. That was my bread and butter.
Well, that's why you're not a Christian anymore, because you didn't read the King James Version.
That's right. I'm not a real one. Not a real Christian. I don't count.
Oh boy. All right. Let's have it. We're starting in the very beginning.
Yes, in the beginning is where we are starting. So Genesis, initially it starts with actually, I think, some really beautiful language. Like the way it talks about it kind of reminds me of Fantasia. Did you ever watch that old Fantasia movie?
Yeah. With the music and
yeah, right? Yeah. So the earth was empty, formless mass, cloaked in darkness. I think that, I don't know, it's pretty language. So as it's discussing initially, there's a mass and there's darkness. God creates light. And then God says, let there be space between the waters to separate water from water, right?
Yeah.
So, painting a visual of what this is supposed to be representing, water from water.
So that's actually a really good question, because in the ancient world, their idea of cosmology was not like ours. So I'm going to pull up a picture, and I want you to just gaze on it for a second, because this is what you should be picturing when you're reading the book of Genesis. And this image was, I think, published initially by something that John Walton had published. He's a scholar that works for Trinity Evangelical Seminary. So it's a really big school. He's a respected scholar. So this is not like something that Justin made up. You know what I mean? This is something that you'll find pretty common in most studies of the ancient Near East. And for some reason, let me see if I can actually get this to open properly. I'm sorry. There we go. the problem with the image that I didn't have it saved off beforehand. Good thing we're not live doing this. And every time the image every time I want to open the image, it takes me to a website that doesn't actually contain the image. All right, here it is.
Yeah.
All right, fantastic. We got the image. I'm going to put it on the screen here. So this is kind of what the ancient Near East was envisioning when it talked about the cosmological order. And so, as you might see, there's waters above. And what are they above? They're above the firmament. And the water below is typically where they would picture like the clouds, like the rain clouds, and also the water of the earth. So this was like the cosmological model, and that's why it talks about there being gates in the firmament to let in the rain, and gates like the floodgates of the heavens opened up during Noah's flood, because all this water contained on the outside of it would actually flood through the gate onto the earth. And so that's actually what's happening here, is that they didn't have this concept of outer space like we have today. And if you read the book of Enoch, they're answering a very fundamental question that people were asking eventually, which was, okay, we've got this firmament over the earth. Cool. But if that's the case, how in the world does the sun go around the earth? Because the sun seems to be trapped in the firmament somehow.
Trapped.
So Enoch, actually, at the time of Enoch, and if you read the Talmudic writings, they spell this out, that they believe there was an air gap that was actually between the firmament and the outer water. And so I know it's crazy. If you're reading First Enoch, it'll come right out. So according to Enoch, what happens is the sun travels around the firmament on the inside, and then there's a gate where the firmament meets the earth, and it exits, and then now it's between the water and the firmament, and it rotates under the earth, and then back through a gate on the other side, and then through the sky.
Sure.
And this might cause some problems as well, because remember in the Bible it says that God sits enthroned above the firmament. And when Ezekiel goes up to heaven to see God, where does he see him? He sees him right at the top of the firmament, right? So the ancient rabbis understood the problem as well, that, well, if there's water up here, how is God up here? And so in the ancient rabbinic writings, they actually describe how thick this air pocket was around the firmament that allowed God to have his heavenly kingdom above the firmament and also divide the waters from the earth. And so that's kind of what you should be envisioning in your head as we're kind of getting through the text in Genesis. And the firmament in the King James Bible, and I think some translations will say expanse, but it's just rakia in Hebrew, which means some sort of a hammered out dome. So like when they hammer out shields or they hammer out bronze bowls and dishes, it uses the root word rakia. So it comes from rakah. And so this was a hard, solid surface, which is why the Bible says that it's solid like a cast mirror. And it's also described as being like a gemstone, like a sapphire.
Okay, I was going to ask what they thought it was made out of. So a very hard substance?
A lot of guesses, yeah, because if you go to Ezekiel talks about this. Either in chapter 10 or chapter 1. I think it might be chapter 10. Let me double check. Yeah, so if you go to Ezekiel 10, it says, "Then I looked above the dome." The dome here is the rakia, the firmament.
Okay.
And that was over the heads of the cherubim. There appeared above them something like sapphire in the form resembling a throne, so on and so forth. So he's recording the throne room of God, which is always described as being bright and blue and sapphire type appearance. And we get the same thing in other parts of the Bible as well. And the ancient Egyptians had the same interesting thoughts themselves. The ancient Egyptians tried to figure out what it was made out of, and they thought this was actually made out of metal, and it reflected the sunlight because it was made out of metal.
Huh.
And so I won't say too much more about that, but there's a guy named Paul Seeley. I think it was Paul H. Seeley, who was a professor at Gordon Cromwell Seminary, wrote a really good paper on this.
Okay.
It's called The Waters Above and the Waters Below. And it describes how the firmament was believed to be formed and shaped all throughout the ancient Near East. And he makes a pretty good argument for why, like, the modern interpreters that are trying to say, no, it just means like the vault of the sky, right? He's like, no, that's not at all what these people believed.
Gotcha. Okay. So that helps. The question I put in there was like, is there any allusion to this being a globe? And I mean, there was something underneath. So the sun goes around. I mean, kind of.
Right.
Sure. Okay.
The depiction of the ancient world actually looks a lot like this. If you see on my back wall, you'll see the Babylonian map of the world. This is the ancient conception of the world, that it was actually just a flat disk and that there was a dome over top of it.
Well, there you go. All right. So moving forward then, we have more description of things being created. We, of course, have the sun and moon after the light is created, but we'll leave that. And then I actually really love this language too. God says, let the waters swarm with fish and every other kind of life. Let skies be filled with birds. I totally picture like Moana, where like Tafiti like touches everything and all these beautiful things come. Like, oh, that's really lovely. That's a beautiful imagery.
It's a great picture.
Right? So we have all the stuff, and then this is going to come up a lot. I have in verse 26, then God said, let us make people. And, right, throughout this, God says us a lot. And what I always heard was that, that's referring to the Trinity, right? Like God is saying us because it's Father, Son, Holy Spirit. What does us mean in this context?
Yeah, the us definitely refers to the divine assembly. And the divine assembly is essentially like the Greek Septuagint refers to the members of the assembly as the angels. And that's kind of where we get this angelology situation from. But prior to the Greek period, the divine assemblies were the individuals are referred to as the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God. And scholars didn't know what that meant for a long time. Like, what did it mean, the sons of God? And some people even theorize that this is referring to like kings of the earth, because David and Solomon are said to be sons of God. But in the early 1900s, we discovered a whole cache of tablets from Ugarit, which is just near Lebanon. Okay. And it turns out that what we found in those tablets matches the material culture that we find in the Bible. And those tablets are from the middle to early Bronze period. So we've discovered a lot of these like archaic phrases in the book of Genesis and elsewhere actually turned up in all of these Ugaritic tablets many hundreds of years prior to the Bible. And it turned out that they gave us a lot of insight as to what these phrases mean.
Okay. So
this divine assembly, according to the Ugaritic tradition, which is the Israelite tradition, were literally the sons of El. You might know him as Elohim in this story. And there was a narrative that there were 70 of them. There were 70 sons of Elohim between him and we'll call her Asherah in the modern language. And these members made up the council, and they would gather together on Mount Zaphon, and they would hold council together. And
wait a minute. So when it says like God created the earth. Is this like when God says, let us make people, is when it says God, I mean, is that indicating El or Elohim, or is it indicating one of the other people?
That's such a good question. Yeah, because in the mythological background, God himself made mankind similar to God in the image of the other sons of God. In fact, the same word that's used when it says that God made man in his image is the same word that's used when it says that Adam had a son in his image.
Oh, weird. Okay.
So it seems to be that the narrator is implying that mankind was made to look like God in some way, which is why all throughout the text, God is described in the same way that man is described. He's got hands, he's got nose, he can smell. It talks about his nose growing hot when he's angry. There's lots of really great anatomy of God throughout the Bible.
Well, even in these first couple chapters, I've noticed a lot of where he creates humans and sort of seems to be surprised by them and wanting to limit their power because they're so close to him. Like it doesn't match with the current idea of like God and then humans way down here. You know, he's like, ooh, I'm a little afraid of how powerful I made them. Like I need to stop that because they seem very close rather than far away.
That's such a good point, and we have to talk about that because a lot of people don't pick up on that, but this is something that like virtually all modern scholars will point out. And I want to illustrate this a little bit. This is Psalm 82, and it says, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. How long will you, right? Yeah, it's pretty wild, right? How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Because according to the ancient tradition, the individual sons of God were put in charge of the individual nations. And you see a little bit of that even in the book of Daniel, where there's a prince of Persia, meaning one of the angels. There's an angel of Persia. There's a prince of Greece. And then there is two different princes that are given to Israel. There's Gabriel and there's Michael. And Michael is the prince of princes. He's the angel over all of them. So there's this idea in the ancient world where God had these sons and they were put in charge of the individual nations. And it was their job to manage each individual nation. And so this is really interesting, because they didn't do a good job, God is judging them in Psalm 82. So he's chastising them for not doing their job, which is why he says near the end, I say you are gods, children of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, you will die like mortals and fall like any prince. So
is that Elohim that's talking? And then
Elohim.
So is he getting mad at the like angel level people or the God level people?
That's the part that is interesting, is that we envision these angels as like created beings, but in the ancient text, the angels were gods. They were referred to as gods. In fact, in the pre-biblical material, they were referred to as Ha-Elohim, the Elohim, meaning the gods. And this makes sense linguistically because we kind of do this today, right? So like, if my buddy, Bob, I got a friend named Bob who's got 7 kids now, but he's got a couple sons that look just like him, right? And in the modern day, we might say, how are your little Bobs doing? You know what I mean? Even their names aren't Bob, obviously, right. But we see the same thing in the ancient language. We'll see, how are the little gods, the Elohim, and there's one other resource actually that'd be really helpful for this, because there did come a point where Elohim took on an additional meaning, or we know now that it has an additional meaning, where Elohim in Hebrew and in other Semitic languages is a concrete abstraction, meaning, for example, the word for virgin in Hebrew is Bethula.
Okay.
To make it plural, you would say Bethulot, and that means virgins in the plural. Now, ironically, it also means virginity, which is an abstraction.
Okay.
Right. So it seems pretty clear, and there's a guy named Joel Bennett who wrote a dissertation on this. He demonstrated very clearly that Elohim, as it's used in at least in the Hebrew Bible, seems to be an abstraction of the word God. So it would more poetically just mean divinity, rather than an actual name.
So in this chapter, every time in my NLT it says the word God, what is that like? What's in the Hebrew? What does it say there?
It says Elohim, actually. So Elohim. This is where it gets fun. So if we go to sorry. I put something on the screen that I think might clear it up. If you go to the Hebrew text, you've got Elohim here, and Elohim can be plural or it can be singular, right? Okay. So right here, it's shown as a plural, but guess what happened? It's attached to this verb here, which is not plural; it's singular. Bara in Hebrew just means to create, and this is in the singular form. So we know that Elohim here is being used as a singular entity. Okay. So that's how we know that this is referring to God. Now, the root of this word is just El, and that just is generic for God. And it also means the name of God in pre-biblical literature. So when you're reading like Ugaritic texts or Canaanite literature, that is not just the word for God, but it's also the name of the highest God.
All right.
Isn't that why?
Clear. All right. So we have a God and maybe lots of gods that are all deciding to create people. And they, in verse 26, God or gods say, "Let us make people in our image to be like ourselves, and they will rule over every stuff." And then, so God created people in his own image, patterned them after himself, male and female, he created them. And in that, I was thinking, what does this mean about the gender of gods? You know, in that if both male and female, are they both patterned after God? And if so, are there male and female gods, or does El have both genders synonymously or simultaneously?
So that's, again, a fantastic question. And if we assume that this portion of Genesis was written around the exilic period, or maybe just slightly before it, it seems to be suggesting that Adam was made initially in the image of God more than Eve, because God is depicted in Genesis as strictly being a male. Like every time there's a verb attached to the name Elohim or Yahweh, it is in the masculine construction. Okay. So it seems to be that the text is indicating that God is a male, but it's not like German and other languages where there's like a neuter. There's really not, like, you can't use. It's very difficult to use a neuter verb in Hebrew. They don't really do it. So if God was genderless, it would be very difficult to say so. They didn't have the language for it. So they had to decide, are we going to give him masculine, or are we going to give God, feminine verbs, and he got the masculine. But this is one of those things where people want to say, in the ancient world, all of the gods, like all the highest gods, were men. But that's not necessarily true. The Bible is actually uniquely misogynistic in this case. Because in the ancient Near East, there was tons of women that were incredibly high up in the pantheon. In fact, you've heard of the character Baal in the Bible. Mm-hmm. So we know tons about Baal from the Ugaritic literature, from Canaanite. And as it turns out, he got his tuchus saved by his sister Anath. If it wasn't for Anath, Baal would still be dead. He'd still be in the underworld right now, swallowed up by Mot.
Nice. Well, I appreciate the additional characters.
But that being said, if you read the letters of Paul actually picks up on this in Corinthians chapter 11, 1 Corinthians 11, says, "For man was made in the image of God, and woman was made in the image of," or the glory, actually, is what it says. I'll put it on the screen so we don't, people don't think I'm misquoting it. So this remember, this is the whole nonsense with the head coverings.
Yeah.
But it says, for a man ought not to have his head veiled, since he is the image and reflection of God. But woman is the reflection of man.
Womp womp.
That's what I say. Yeah, Paul's a character.
Yeah, that is a good way of putting it. Well, and on that, on that same vein, in the end, middle-ish of chapter 2, when they're talking about the formation of Eve, and God makes Adam, and Adam is the star, and Adam does the things, and Eve is his companion, and the idea that, okay, God says, I'm going to, take a rib from you and make you, and she will be called woman because she was taken out of man. And it is so interestingly patriarchal, because it's just like completely discounting the fact that actually all men are birthed from women. Like, they are the ones who are creating life. But, this framing is that, well, actually you take it from the rib. So man is really creating women. Right.
Yeah. And I think that's where Paul kind of got this narrative from. And I agree with you. It's inherently a misogynistic text, and I think it was used quite effectively in ancient times to let women know where their status was in society. Right. So I don't read. I know a lot of modern pastors want to tell you that like the Bible is somehow egalitarian. It's not. Even in Genesis 3, it says that, women's desires will be for their husbands, but their husbands will rule over them. Yeah. And even the title for a woman or a wife, Isha, says that she was called Isha because she came from man, which is Ish. So even the title that we call women is derived in Hebrew from the word for a man.
Well, and just a PSA, if anyone, it's been a while since you had a physiology class, men and women do have the same number of ribs. Just did want to put that out there. They do not have a different number. It's the same.
Yeah, I heard that rumor actually when I was a teenager in youth group, and somebody brought that up. I was like, I don't know, that can't. I took biology class. That I didn't remember learning anything about that.
Like, should I count? Like, hang on. Count yours.
Right.
Oh, man. Okay. So let's see. I kind of skipped a little bit. So we made Adam and we made Eve, and God says you can eat anything you want except fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. If you eat its fruit, you will surely die. Right. Mm-hmm. So then we start chapter 3, and there is a serpent in the garden for unknown reasons. We don't know why. It just is there. And it can talk. And so the serpent talks to Eve, which is weird. It just says the woman. Why don't we get to use her name? But whatever. It says, "You won't die," the serpent hissed. "God knows your eyes will be opened when you eat it. You will become just like God, knowing everything, both good and evil." And the woman was convinced. So he's telling her the truth, right? Like, it's interesting how it keeps being referenced as she's being deceived or she's being tricked. But he just told her the truth about what was going to happen. And God did not want her to be able to distinguish good from evil. Is that correct?
That is 100% the case, yeah. And this is one of the things, and you've heard it before, Christians will, they'll bend over backwards to say that the text didn't actually mean what it says. Satan couldn't have been telling the truth, and God couldn't have lied. But it reads exactly the way you described it. Satan was saying that when, in the day that you eat of it, your eyes will be open, you'll be like God. And you've already read the whole chapter. You know what happens at the end of it. says that their eyes were open, knowing they knew good and evil, and they, they were like God.
Right? I mean, they're
Verse 22, right?
yeah. Oh yeah, it sure says that. And it's, once their eyes are open, this is another in this chapter, another example of the God that's being described is very physical, very human, and very limited, which again, we don't talk about, especially in evangelical Christianity, but toward the evening, they heard God walking about in the garden. So they hid themselves, and the Lord says, "Where are you?" He replies, and God says, "Who told you you were naked? Did you eat the fruit I commanded you not to do?" So either God genuinely doesn't know, or he's being incredibly condescending and pretending like he doesn't know just to like make Adam confess.
Yeah, and that's how it was taught to me in Catholic school growing up, was obviously God is all-knowing, so he couldn't be asking, in reality, it must be a rhetorical question.
Right.
But if that's the case, what purpose does it serve in the dialogue?
Oh, yeah, like why phrase it this way in the dialogue? I mean, I guess it is reminiscent maybe of like when a parent is trying to like sort of chastise a small child, a young child, now, did you eat the crayons? Did you tell me you ate the crayons? I mean, maybe you could justify it that way. Yeah, but he seems very human in that part.
Right. Well, in the ancient Near East, the gods didn't necessarily have this omniscience.
Mm-hmm.
That's not something that was like attributed to the gods until many hundreds of years later. And so the God that we find in Genesis reads a lot like the gods of the ancient world. So like in ancient Babylon, when it tells the creation story, if you read the Enuma Elish, it talks about how they created mankind and they were going to do like all the work on the earth that the gods didn't want to do. They're going to do the dirty work, right? But as it turns out, the plan kind of backfired because they were making all this noise and it was preventing the gods from getting rest. And like, never mind, wipe them out. Get them out of here, clean them out. And we see like similar overtones in Genesis. In fact, when he places Adam in the garden, it says that he made Adam to work the garden in a lot of translations, but in the Hebrew language, it uses the verb avad, meaning to serve, just like a servant or a slave would work. So there's a lot of echoes from ancient Babylon that are kind of hidden in this story.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Well, and he, God finds out, they get punished. And very clearly, I know sometimes we get pushback about this, but, very clearly God is saying, you did a bad thing. Here is your punishment. Like I am punishing you. These are not just naturally occurring consequences, right? And that right at the end of that chapter, though, what I hadn't read this for a very long time, and it says, "Then the Lord God said, the people have become as we are, knowing everything, both good and evil. He banishes them from the garden." Oh, he says, "What if they eat the fruit of the tree of life? Then they will live forever." He's very concerned about if they eat this other fruit, then they're going to live forever. And we don't want that. So now he has to have an angel with a flaming sword so they don't get more powers that God didn't want them to have. Is that right? Is that right?
You nailed it. Yeah, absolutely. So again, this is another like really common theme of the time period where, and you mentioned it before, and I didn't really get around to discussing it because I got distracted by other stuff, but this idea that like there needs to be a separation between mankind and the gods. This is where we see the separation, and this is why we see the separation. The separation needs to be had because now humans are like the gods. They can know good and evil, and they could do good and they can do evil, and therefore we shouldn't let them live forever. And if I don't know how far we're going to go, but if we get to the tower narrative, it becomes very clear in the tower narrative that the problem with the tower, it seems to be echoing that mankind, now that they're in this fallen state, could actually reach the heavens and intrude on the abode of the gods. And this is described in the Book of Jubilees and other Jewish literature, where they're afraid that the humans are literally going to storm the heavens, right? So the gods are actually a little bit afraid of humanity. And this sounds crazy to us in the modern day. Why would gods be, afraid of humans? But again, if you read any of the ancient Near Eastern literature from the time period, it reads a lot the same. The gods did have a reason, because they're like, well, mankind could get out of control. You know what I mean? Because the gods aren't omnipotent. They're not all powerful. They can't do anything they want to.
Yeah, it reminds me of the movie Hercules.
Yeah.
Great visuals of the gods living up of Mount Olympus, and here comes Hercules, and all right.
People don't realize how accurate that is to other parts of the world. Like in biblical times, this is how even the Jews pictured Yahweh existing.
Yeah.
Just up in the sky.
Up in the sky. All right. So they get kicked out of Eden, right? There's a flaming sword. They can't go back. They have 2 kids. They have Cain, they have Abel. And they have to keep giving sacrifices to God. Also, this might be completely irrelevant, but in the first 2 chapters, this version translates everything as God. And now a lot of the times in that same place, the word is the Lord. Is there any reason that they would select one over the other, or are they just synonyms?
Yeah, actually, really good reason. Let me grab you. I'm going to show you a book real quick I think you might be interested in.
Oh, I love the books.
I know it's sitting back here. Hold on.
Amongst your many tomes.
Eventually, I'll organize them so I actually can find stuff when I need it. But I was using it recently.
Is it one of those super old looking ones?
No, it's actually one of the newer ones. Actually, on the topic that you just brought up, maybe I don't have it up here. Anyways, there's a book that I usually have behind me called Who Wrote the Bible? And it's actually not referring to the whole Bible, it's referring to the Hebrew Bible. And it's by Richard Elliott Friedman. He's actually Jewish.
Okay.
And he also wrote another book called The Bible with Sources Revealed. And so he's involved in the source criticism of the Bible, meaning where the individual narratives came from and who wrote what. But it's commonly held that there were basically multiple strands of literature all pulled together by a number of redactors over history. And there are 4 redactors that are given to the bulk of the Old Testament from the early days. So we'll say Genesis through Judges at least. And some people would also include the Deuteronomy and also Kings and Samuel. So the reason why this happens is quite because there's different traditions that were preserving texts. And in the North, remember what we were talking about Ugarit earlier? And they had this pantheon with El at the very top of the pantheon. Well, ironically, the texts that seem to come from northern Israel all refer to God as Elohim or El. The texts that talk about God being the Lord, a lot of them were from the southern redactors from Judea. And when you see the Lord in capital letters in the original text, that's actually the name Yahweh.
Oh.
So there's basically, it seems to be that there were actually 2 different kingdoms, the Judeans in the south and the Israelites in the north, and they eventually merged, and their mythologies merged as well. And so it used to be that El and Yahweh were probably separate deities, and that they were combined into one deity. And you kind of see that. That's why we have Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 can read completely separate from each other as completely separate creation events that were combined when the northern kingdoms and the southern kingdoms had to merge together. And on the topic of God living in the clouds, like you were saying before, I would suggest Where the Gods Are by Mark S. Smith. He's a professor, I want to say, where is he at Princeton. He's a professor at Princeton. And also on that same concept, Richard J. Clifford wrote a book called The Cosmic Mountain. He's professor at Boston University, and they describe the gods exactly the same way you do, except they show all of the ancient literature that demonstrates that to be the case. So the Lord is just a mask for the name Yahweh.
Okay.
And it says Yahweh rather than Elohim because it's a different people group that preserved the tradition.
Interesting.
But they combined them, and I'll show you where I'll show you how they combined it. Actually, if you go to Exodus chapter 6, they got smart and they figured out that we need to actually tell people how it is that two gods are one God, because it's very confusing. So this is when God is speaking to Moses at the bush. It says, God also spoke to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord. That means Yahweh. I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty, which is El Shaddai in the Hebrew language, which El, meaning God from the Northern Territory traditions, says, but by my name Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them. So here he's saying, listen, these people, this older tradition, they knew me as El. They knew me as the highest God. But no, my actual name is Yahweh. And that's how they're dealing with this problem, is they're saying, we need to have an explanation for why your God is actually the same as our God. Pretty crazy.
I mean, it puts into more context, I think, the focus on like naming and say I am a lot, learning about that as a kid and a young adult. I was always taught that, well, it's just really important that, I don't know, God is who he is, or we have to recognize God. But it wasn't like, I never got really a good explanation. So that's interesting.
Well, we'll touch on this as we go through, because we're going to get flavors from the north and the south that keep butting up against each other at every turn. And the Cain and Abel story is another one that seems to be telling the narrative subliminally about the north and the south at odds with each other.
Well, yeah, let's see, coming right up, I have so many questions about the logistics of what is about to happen.
Right. Let's do it. Yeah.
So Cain doesn't give God a good sacrifice, and he's mad about it. And what's interesting to me too about this passage, though, is that it really reads like God is physically there talking audibly to Cain and Abel. So Cain is mad at his brother and kills him. And then afterwards, the Lord asks Cain, where's your brother? Where is he? And I love this answer. I don't know, Cain retorted. Am I supposed to keep track of him wherever he goes? That is the bad.
It's such a good one.
And like they're having this audible conversation, and it seems like God is just there. And then he sends Cain away. He's like, no, you're banished. And Cain's like, what are you talking about? I can't be banished from your presence, and not a presence of God that's like everywhere spiritually, but like, no, this is where God hangs out, and I'm kicking you out and you don't get to hang out with me anymore.
Yeah, it's a wild story. There's kind of two things happening here. And we mentioned like this northern theme versus the southern theme. But take note of what sacrifice he liked.
He liked the animals. He was mad about the vegetables.
Right. Yeah. I mean, listen, I get it. If you have to choose between like asparagus and the steak, you're picking the steak every time. God likes a good barbecue. But this is actually really emblematic of the situation that we have in the ancient world where there's this trope in the ancient world where there was a fight between, are the shepherds more important or are the farmers more important? And there's actually a text that talks about this from ancient Babylon. I think it's just called The Shepherd versus the Farmer. And I actually think I've got a copy of it with me. Give me just a second and I'll tell you if I've got an electronic copy I can pull up real quick. But there's a book called The Ancient Near Eastern Texts Relating to the Old Testament by James Pritchard. And it's free. You can get it online. Nowadays, I think it's in the open domain. But that being said, this is kind of tapping into that particular motif. But more importantly, it turns out that we know a lot about ancient Israel and Judea. Because in the south, they prioritized shepherding because they lived in the foothills. It was rocky. It was hard to grow stuff. In the north, they prioritized growing wheat and barley and things, right? In fact, during the Roman period, northern Israel was considered like the breadbasket for the Roman Empire. So it's really interesting that we've now got this ancient Babylonian motif of shepherd versus farmer that also plays into the northern kingdom versus the southern kingdom. And it's also true that the northern kingdom, there's a second motif. The Israelites appear from history to be older, like they were there first. Okay. So they're like the older brother, right? They're like the big brother. And then the little brother is the smaller kingdom of Judah down in the south that came later. They're the second brother. But guess who's always blessed in the Old Testament? It's always the younger, not the eldest brother. So we've got two motifs happening in Cain and Abel, which is the younger kingdom versus the older kingdom, and the shepherds versus the farmers. And that's kind of like the subtext of what's happening here, because otherwise the text doesn't really serve a good purpose.
Interesting.
Right?
Well, I mean, we were always taught like, well, you have to be respectful of God and like, don't, and if you screw up, just admit you screw up. Don't, off your brother.
Right. So in the ancient texts, there's we won't read it out, but there's it's called Dumuzi verse Enkim. I can't say the word Enkim-du, the dispute between the shepherd god and the farmer god. So anyone who wants to look that up can look that up. But sorry, I wanted to throw that in before we moved on.
Well, I mean, the context of this actually being potentially about North and South makes a little bit more sense, because so far in the text, there are only 4 humans, and that's it. Like those humans have been mentioned, period. And it reads as if there are no other humans. And then as soon as Cain gets banished, he's freaked out because he's like, what if people attack me? Like, what do you mean? Which people? Who is it that you are afraid of? And God's like, don't worry, I'll protect you, because I'll tell them that if they beat you up, I'm going to beat them up 7 times as badly. And then Cain goes off and has a wife, where, again, the mysterious people.
I know. So there's a couple solutions to this. And I think the one that I always liked as a Christian, and I still kind of like it today, and I think it flows with Genesis 5, which is that it's likely that they already had more kids by this time point. They just didn't get mentioned. Or it's possibly just that the editors cut stuff out. And we see that happening all the time in Genesis, where the editors had a longer narrative and they're like, we got to cut stuff out. It's too long. I mean, something's got to get cut. And then they cut very important things out, or they put it in the wrong order. So in the narrative of Jacob and Esau reuniting in the Promised Land, if you read in the book of Genesis, they actually get some of the stuff out of order, which is wild. So it talks about where they're living, and then later, like a couple chapters later, it says that it goes back to them living where they were living before they had moved to the other place. It got the order wrong. So all that to say there's a lot of anachronisms in the book of Genesis. This could be one of them. This could be that the editor just cut something out and forgot that we need to actually explain to somebody that there were other people, or if it's not something that was out of order, it was just out of sight, out of mind. The editor didn't think about it, and when they were making up the mythology, which happens, that's what happens when you make mythology. When you're inventing a narrative, eventually there's going to be a plot hole in the narrative. And you've seen probably YouTube videos on movies where they're like, all the plot holes in such and such movie.
Yeah, well, and I just coming up, we won't get to it today, but I noticed that a lot with the story of Abraham. Like, God makes a covenant with him like 3 times in a row, and it's the exact same covenant. Like, you already did that, man. Like, what? Why are we doing this again? Why is Abraham surprised? We've done that already.
Yeah, the triplet of nearly having your wife taken is a wild one.
Oh, yeah. Okay, we're gonna get to that one. There's all this. I did circle that in Cain's descendants, they are already having multiple wives. It's not addressed as good or bad, so it's not necessarily advocating for it, but it's interesting that within 3 generations of humans, there were multiple wives.
It didn't take very long.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, the Bible never condemns it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, God several times is like, okay, well, why don't you grab another one? Like, this wife didn't work out. I'm gonna give you more and take another. It's fine. Right.
Yeah. God had a lot of opportunities to fix the polygamy thing if he was really against it. On the note of anachronism, it just occurred to me as well. There's 2 really interesting anachronisms that we've covered, but we didn't mention, which is that when he kicked the mankind out of the garden, what did he put in front of it to guard the entrance? It was a flaming sword, but swords had yet to have been invented yet. The metallurgy doesn't exist for like another 2 or 3 more chapters. So no one knew what a sword was. Nobody could have possibly identified what a sword was, which means God created the first metallurgical piece, which also means he created the first weapon of war.
That doesn't surprise me given this character. There's so much war. It's like his MO, really.
It really is. And we read in like another 1 or 2 chapters that one of the almost immediate descendants, I think, of Lamech is a metal, not just a metal worker, but an iron smelter, which is interesting because theoretically they were smelting iron, I don't know, about 2,000 years prior to the Iron Age.
Sure.
So that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it's Lamech's kid. No, Lamech. Yep, worked with metal. Well, magic.
Yeah, and it does in the actual Hebrew text. It refers to smelting iron. So Iron Age starts about 1000 BCE. This is roughly 4000 BCE. So they're off by a bit.
A little bit, just a touch. Yeah. Well, and my NLT has this handy dandy timeline there's Heavy Bible. So it has this timeline in which it has no date for creation and no date for Noah. And the first date is Abram born in 2166.
That's about right. That's where most people put Abraham. And there's a really helpful volume called The Annals of the World. It's very famous. It's done by I think I forget if he was like Anglican, but he was a bishop of some nature. And he went and corroborated all of the ancient texts of the world with the biblical text and put together a timeline of when everything in the Bible would have happened, and he documented it. And he has the creation of the world in 4004 BCE. So if anyone's listening, they got a little bit of change hanging around. Get yourself a copy of the Annals of the World by Mr. Usher. You won't regret it. It's a great book.
That is what we all do when we read for pleasure. Read the Annals of the World.
I mean, I figured you did, like on your bookshelf, had it sitting right next to Twilight.
Gosh, I don't have that one, do I? Nope. I have a lot of novels, though. A lot of novels. Okay, let's do Noah, and then that'll probably be it for today.
Okay. Noah, it's such a fun story.
Well, it's interesting reading this in NLT too, because I've recently read this particular chapter in NIV. This felt different. So it starts off saying the human population began to grow rapidly on earth. The sons of God saw beautiful women and took them as their wives.
Yeah.
So in this sons of God, is that those like angels / gods?
That's
vibe?
it.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So then the Lord is, he's kind of annoyed that people are living so long. So my spirit will not put up with humans for such a long time. I guess he's already annoyed, for they are mortal flesh. In the future, they will live no more than 120 years. Cool. And then also it says in those days, giants lived on the earth, but I do have an asterisk that says maybe that also means Nephilim.
Yeah.
For whenever the sons of God had intercourse with human women, they gave birth to children who became the heroes mentioned in legends of old. Okay, now that is Hercules, right?
You're not far off. There's this idea in the ancient world, and it shows up in the Bible, and the whole book of Enoch is about this. If you read the Book of the Watchers, which is in First Enoch, it's all about this section of Genesis, where the actual deities, these divine beings, came down and mated with human women, and they had giant offspring. In fact, it says, I know, oh, it's so bad. And okay, it's wild, but okay. And even they come up later in the book of Numbers. They're still around. King Og of Bashan is listed as one of them. The whole tribe of Anak is referred to as giants. The Gittites, also from Gath, were considered to be a race of giants. Yes, Goliath.
This is what Goliath is?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Goliath is one of these giants that are descendant of the Nephilim. And the Nephilim is a real funny word, because depending on what time period the text is from or when it was edited is going to depend on what you think that word means. And a lot of scholars think that it comes from the Hebrew word nephal, meaning to fall. And they're referring to fallen angels, and it's in the passive tense. So it could refer to the fallen ones, but also if it was written later during the Aramaic period, they've got a word in Aramaic, Nephilim, which is translated as giants. And in the Greek Septuagint, it translated as gigantes in Greek, which means giant. So there seems to be some confusion on what the original intention of the text was, because we don't know exactly when it was written.
Okay.
But either way, all of biblical tradition has interpreted this as being angels or gods coming down, mating with humankind, producing giant offspring. And remember, Gilgamesh, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And Hercules, you already mentioned. So any deity that's like part human, part deity, they're very human-like. They live here on the earth because they're mixed. They can't live in heaven. So they're here on the earth, but they have these godlike powers. Right. And so we have these Nephilim now, these fallen, giants that are down here on the earth. And God's like, this ain't good.
Right.
Don't need that.
You know, what's really interesting though is that, so there's that paragraph about, that happening. Okay. We've got the Nephilim, giants, whatever. And then the next paragraph, it's sort of like switching topics a little bit, because then it says the Lord observed the extent of people's wickedness. And I know, I think in my NIV, it said humankind, and it seems like it's not like God is upset that the Nephilim exist. He's mad at humans because humans are wicked. In my version, it says he observed the extent of people's wickedness, and he saw that all their thoughts were consistently and totally evil.
Yeah, and that's not too far from what it actually says.
Okay.
So modern scholars and even ancient scholars have all kind of assumed that the Nephilim were a problem, but that's not necessarily why mankind had to be wiped out. It was, you mentioned before, the breaking of the human divine barrier. Mm-hmm. That seems to be the biggest issue here. Is now we've got these gods and humans mingling. And so the humans themselves not only are wicked, but now they're corrupting the heavenly beings, which they don't want. They don't want the gods to be like the humans. The humans are like, they're dirty, they're subservient, they're temporary. And the reason why the gods are in the skies is because it's clean, it's pure, it's pristine, everything's perfect up there. And so there's this idea that mankind needs to be down here because they're wicked and they're sinful and they're dirty and they dig in the dirt of the ground to grow the crops. And you know what I mean? That's why Satan was so they're really painting this picture of like how different the gods and mankind are, which is why it's so evil that mankind and gods are mating with each other now. That's like the most evil thing you can do.
Interesting. And then, the next verse, it says, so the Lord was sorry he ever made them. And then it broke his heart.
It says it broke his heart. No way.
I wanted to check that one with you.
No, it doesn't say that. It does not say that.
It's chapter 6, verse 6.
Yeah, so it says the Lord was sorry that he had made humans on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. There's no Hebrew equivalent to having a broken heart. It did grieve him. It made him sorry to his heart. It does say that in the text. But listen, the NLT it's a poetic, translation. It's beautiful. It really is. They're doing the best they can.
Well, it is really interesting editing there, and I've had this debate with people with some frequency of, is God experiencing regret?
Yes,
right? And I got in an argument with somebody once who was pulling up the Hebrew word and saying that it just means like experiencing like sorrow for something. But does that word truly mean like I regretted this, like I did the wrong thing?
Yeah. So what you find in the text, where it says that the Lord was sorry or regretted, it uses the Hebrew word nacham. And what this actually means is to have like a change of mind, right? And so, for example, in the book of Numbers, when it says that God is not a man that he should lie, nor a son of man that he would change his mind, same word.
Oh, interesting.
Also in Exodus 32, when it says that God wanted to wipe out all the Israelites for the whole golden calf narrative, and Moses talks him off the ledge and says, no, don't do that. And then after Moses talks him off the ledge, it says that God changed his mind about the disaster that he was going to bring upon the people. And so we get the same thing here, that God was of the opinion, obviously, that he wanted mankind, but now that they've acted this way, he's like, I changed my mind. I don't think I like these people.
It's so amazingly different, like just reading the text as it is versus
Right.
interpreting it through this evangelical lens. Like if you
Right.
first hear God is good, God individually loves you personally and wants this individual relationship and so many of these characteristics. And when you read this character in Genesis, it is not that. Like you have to do the words don't mean words to make that those two ideas mesh together.
I agree. You said earlier that the God so far seems limited.
Mm-hmm.
And that's such a good observation, because as we're reading this, at every turn, God is like, he doesn't know what to expect. He's like caught off guard.
Right.
And he's reacting to things. So they go, oh no, what do we do? So I think when we keep reading through Genesis, we're just going to see more of the same. This God that seems a lot like it was made up like early man, to be a lot like early man.
Right. Yeah. Well, and so God's like, all right, I'm going to wipe out this human race I have created. Yes, and I will destroy all the animals and birds too. Why is he mad at the animals and the birds? Like, what?
The poor birds.
Right. Oh, that's hard to, like, how do you justify, like, why, what?
Yeah, I know. It's a weird thing too, because remember, if we assume that God's all powerful, he could like snap his fingers and do anything he wants to. Well, it would make sense that he doesn't need to kill all the animals. He could just snap his fingers and like kill all the humans. But some of the animals probably still die anyways, because like we've got all these farm animals that need to be taken care of by humans. But I mean, to your point, he doesn't have to kill any of these humans. It seems so. Again, we keep talking about the Babylonian text. Everything from chapter 1 to chapter 11 is paralleled in the Babylonian literature, which is why most scholars believe that Genesis 1 through 11 is doing a lot of polemicizing against the Babylonian culture, because it was primarily edited while they were in Babylonian captivity and while they were interacting with the Babylonians. In fact, a lot of the Hebrew scribes were learning to be scribes while they were in Babylon, while they were in captivity. And so we know, for example, in ancient Babylon, what do you give them to learn how to write? A lot of them learned how to write by copying like the Gilgamesh epic, right? So like when you're learning a language, you take one of the most popular stories, one that like everyone knows, and it's simple enough, it's easy language, and you learn to translate that first. So that's so all these Jewish scribes that got trained in Babylon, they knew these Babylonian tales. And they're like, when they got out of captivity, they're like, no, let me tell you how it really happened. And we're going to retell these stories, but my God is in control now. My God is the one doing all these things. And so it's almost like an argument against the Babylonians, because everybody in the ancient world had a flood myth. So they needed to explain how it was that the flood happened, but their God was in charge of it. And their explanation was, well, God didn't have a choice. Mankind was so bad, because in the Babylonian narrative, the gods kind of look stupid. Like the flood was a reaction, right? Nice. The flood was just like a reaction to, oh my gosh, we didn't think the humans were going to do that. So the Hebrew text is trying to fix that a little bit. They're like, no. The flood needed to happen because mankind was just so bad.
Interesting. I know we wanted to keep this around an hour, and I got so many more chapters, and I have all these questions about like the logistics of the flood, but I think that will take us like another 40 minutes. I
know. That's the problem with the flood narrative, is once you really get into it, there's so much meat on the bone there. But there's so I did find the book I was looking for, The Bible with Sources Revealed by Richard Elliott Freeman. And anyone who is interested in the source criticism, he does go through and highlight which parts of the Noah story goes to which redactor. So you can actually read the Noah story segregated into two different stories and see how they would have read in the original context. Right? Because right now, the Noah story is two different flood myths that are smushed together, which is why it seems to have contradictory details. Like
the 2, but then the 7 animals.
And the 40 versus the 371, because
there's a lot of days, and then there's more days, and then there were more days.
Yeah, it's like, wait, I thought it was 40 days. Now it's like over a year. What's going on here?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, when you separate the sources, because you'll clearly see where it's talking about Elohim doing stuff, Elohim doing this, and then you got another section where it's like Yahweh did this, Yahweh did that. And you're like, wait a minute, these are clearly different sources that have been smushed together. And so Richard Elliott Freeman separates the two sources, and others have done this as well. I think Dr. Jennifer Bird in one of her books did this as well, where you can actually read the stories now side by side from the Elohist source and the Yahwist source. And it makes much more sense when you read the two different narratives separately than smushing them together.
Wild. So do current Christian scholars and theologians, people who are their job isn't purely academic, but if they know this information, I mean, how do you, if you are an academic, how do you reconcile that idea with this being the word of God? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a tough one, because so when I was in Bible college, this theory, the multiple source theory, is referred to as shorthand the JDP theory, or the documentary hypothesis is the long name of it. And this is baseline introduction to the Old Testament type of teaching. This is not a liberal thing. Like this. So, for example, I'll show you the textbook that was kind of standard for a long time. Give me a second. I got the website trying to open. There we go. So for a long time, this was like a standard textbook for Old Testament introduction. Like if you went to Bible college or seminary, there's a couple that are like it. It was put out by 3 really good scholars. David Allen Hubbard, probably the most popular of them. But anyways, the long and short of it is, even in the first couple chapters, they're like, okay, here's the documentary hypothesis. Here's what scholars believe. This is not very widely disputed. And this is just something that you learn when you go to Bible college that you don't tell your church, because the church doesn't want to hear that. The church wants to hear that Moses wrote all of it. But if Moses wrote all of it, there's so many confusing bits, because Moses is contradicting himself left and right. Like if one author wrote all of it, why does he keep changing the name from God? Why does he keep contradicting himself? Why does he tell the same story twice? How did Moses tell his own death? Why does Moses say that he's the most humble man that have ever lived? Why are there sections that are written from the western side of the river, referring to events happening on the eastern side of the river, when Moses never crossed over to the western side of the river? That never happened. Why is Moses referring to in Genesis that there were kings in Israel? Moses lived hundreds of years before there were ever kings in Israel. He shouldn't have known that. Why does Genesis 14 say that Abraham chased his opponents as far as the land of Dan, when the land of Dan didn't exist until the Israelites already settled the land hundreds of years later? So we have all these really weird anomalies in the text that Mosaic authorship can't explain, but documentary hypothesis explains it very well. And so, sorry, this is a long-winded answer, but this idea that there are multiple texts being put together and compiled into one, semi-cohesive narration isn't much disputed. The only question in scholarship is, how divided was it really? Were there 4 sources that were smushed together? Were there a lot of sources that were just smushed together by 4 editors? Were there originally 4 sources that were added to variously over the time periods? That's the fragmentary hypothesis. So there's some discussion as to how the fragments came together, but there's really no discussion in scholarship about Mosaic authorship. That ship sailed so many years ago. If you go to Bible college or seminary talking about Mosaic authorship, they'll tell you to go take your desk to the hallway.
Well, and I think as we keep going, it's going to be, I'm going to see that same problem over and over again of how do you claim that this is a perfect text when it very clearly is not. But
right.
You and I both have that discussion with people all the time.
I know. And I love the fact that you're so detail oriented. Like when you're reading the text, you're picking up on all the same stuff that you'll read in the scholarly literature, because a lot of Christians aren't really reading the text and noticing all the little details. But that's what scholars get paid to do, is to, criticize the most minute little details. And you're so good at picking those details out and be like, hey, wait a minute. What is this?
It is really interesting to see this with new eyes. It's like a whole different text.
To me, it's more fun, because when I was a Christian, I found all these problems in the text, and I was like, well, I mean, how can I make this say what I need it to say so that it doesn't contradict my religion?
Yeah.
But as an ex-Christian and exvangelical, now I can read it. I'm like, oh, this is a lot of fun, because I know what's happening here. I don't have to pretend like this story needs to fit into my dogma anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't have to try and say, okay, what's God really telling me? And how is this, it seems like it's bad, but I know it's good. So how do I figure that out? It's much less stressful.
Right. Yeah, it really is a lot less stressful. And you get to have more hypotheses on the table. So when you're reading a difficult text, you're like, when you're a Christian, you're like, there's only a couple of hypotheses you're allowed to consider before you're a heretic.
Right.
But from our end, you're like, listen, there's a lot of hypotheses and we can explore all of them, and it doesn't matter because we're not, no one's going to call us a heretic.
Figure out what we think happened. End of list.
Right. Oh, man. But Sarah, I had a great time.
Thank you. I'm so glad that you came, and thank you for letting me basically quiz you for an hour.
I loved it. This is some of my favorite stuff to do. I love a good Q&A. And so I think we're going to have a lot of fun as we continue moving through these books. And you're going to really love when we get to the fun stuff, like the sacrifices and the burning of entrails and things like that.
God, yes. I'm going to have so many questions, and most of which are like, what?
Break the donkey's neck for why?
Oh, God.
Sorry. I got too graphic. Sorry.
Well, to everyone who joined us, thank you so much. And we will be doing this on the regular. So please join us again in the future as we make our way through the Bible.
Have a good one.
All right.